policy statement that you have on your chair when you walk in. Because there were so many questions. There were so many questions about what we were talking about. The leaders that are leading this effort got together in Utah in October of this year. And we held a conference and we asked the participants to come up with a public policy statement. What did we agree on in terms of this transfer? And you've got a copy of that and you'll see what we agreed on. We worked on this until the support was unanimous for it. Again, these were elected officials from 14 states, county commissioners, representatives, senators. We had a lieutenant governor from Alaska very involved, attorney general, lieutenant attorney generals, and so forth. But we say right here in item number 2, we support excluding existing national parks, congressionally designated wilderness areas, Indian reservations, and military installations from the transfer. So what we're requesting really is the multiple use lands, the general forest lands and the BLM lands. They're supposed to be managed for multiple use. And the lands that we know that access, health, and productivity is important. We're not talking about transferring wilderness or national parks. Yes, sir.
So I'm trying to understand the legality. I mean, obviously as a state we can sue the federal government to try to accomplish what we want, whether it's going to be productive or not. So if the state is then managing that and say we as citizens are not happy with the way the state's managing, then what are our legal aspects to force the state to do what we feel is right?
Yeah, well, you have a lot more power over your state representatives and your state senators and your governor and your lieutenant general because they work only for Montanans and they represent only Montanans. In Congress in Washington, D.C., we have 3 members in Congress that are from Montana that represent Montana out of 535. So even if we have the best representatives in D.C. doing the best job they can, they have a very small influence over that entire Congress. And those eastern states, they don't have the same problems, so it's not a priority for them. Here in Montana, this is a high priority for us. You saw that the evidence, it was ranked as the Montana legislature's #2 overall priority. We know there's problems, we want to fix them. How many times have you been in a public meeting with your congressman when it's not campaign season? And how many times have you been in a meeting with your elected state legislators and your county commissioners? You have access to us, you have access to your county commissioners. We don't really have access to our congressional representatives. They live in Washington, D.C. most of the time, and they can't get much done back there anyway. So
you're saying the feds would make changes or implement changes, say 2 or 3 or whatever times a year when they convene, whereas the state can do it all year round, and you could see changes all year?
I think what we need to do, and this is part of the plan, is to come up with a plan to identify what those policies are. But I am a strong advocate of putting the decision-making powers at the local level wherever we can. So I would want the county commissioners to have a very strong say in how the lands in their county are managed. And, you know, I'd like to see supermajority required if there's anything changes to the land management. Supermajority from the county, supermajority from the legislature, and give the citizens a simple majority override power. So I want to put some mechanisms into place and working on those mechanisms so that the people have a lot more say in the land management. Back.
2 questions. Does it look like Utah will be successful December 31st? Is that going to get pushed through? And how does Idaho look in following along with this?
Utah set a date certain of December 31st, 2014, demanding that the lands be transferred by that time. Part of the reason they did that is because any time that you make a demand, you have to say by when. And so they put a date. It was a 2-year period from the time they passed the legislation. I don't expect they're going to file the lawsuit on December 31st. They're waiting to see what the federal government does, and then they'll move. But I know they've put together a legal team. They appropriated $2 million to the legal fund to sue if they have to. But really where their effort has been educating other states and trying to get other states to band together so that we can compel Congress to act so we don't have to sue them. And that's the preference, is to actually get our Congress to act. And we're starting to see a lot of interest at the congressional level now. I think we're going to see legislation in Congress next year calling for the transfer of public lands. I don't know, what the chances are it will pass the first time. That fellow Thomas Hart Benton, a Democrat from Missouri, he had to bring his bill over and over and over before it finally passed. But it did, and it makes sense, and I think it will as more people get educated about it. As far as Idaho, they formed a public land transfer task force. I believe it was the last session in 2013 they formed it. Wyoming formed one, Nevada formed one, Montana had a federal land study. This time I think we're going to move forward with the actual public land transfer task force to start answering these questions in greater detail, to start formulating a plan, to make sure that it works for us, to make sure that it's the right thing to do for Montana. So there's steps that need to be taken. I can tell you in Canada, earlier this year in April, the federal government transferred full authority and control of all of the federally controlled public lands, waters, and natural resources in the Northwest Territories were transferred to the local government of the Northwest Territories. And it's an amazing decision that they made, an agreement that they came to is really, really cool when you look at it. We had them come in and testify at the legislature. They actually worked on their agreement for 10 years. It took 10 years of figuring out how to do it. And they repealed federal acts and put in territorial acts to replace the federal acts so that the management and the regulation is now handled by the local government. And the federal government is actually paying them to do it. The same amount of money that Canada was spending on land management in the Northwest Territories, they block granted to the Northwest Territories. They gave them those funds and said, you do it. We know that decisions tend to be better when they're made by people closer to the subject matter. So here's the money, you manage the resources. The Northwest Territories' biggest opposition was from the bureaucrats that worked for the federal government. They, of course, didn't want to lose their jobs. So what they worked into the deal, and for a couple of reasons, I think was to help satisfy those concerns, but also they wanted a smooth transition. So the Northwest Territories took all that money that the federal government was giving them to manage the lands, and they hired the federal employees to go to work for them. So now you've got all these people that did work for the federal government in that territory that were familiar with the resources, that had worked there their entire careers, that now work for the Northwest Territories, but they got a new boss and a new direction that's more responsive to the people. The other thing that they agreed to do was to split the proceeds of the resource production from the natural resources, so the federal government will get half, 50%, and the Northwest Territories keeps 50%. So they came up with an agreement that works really well up there. And they did that. It's not a earth-shattering, brand new thing. Actually, the Yukon Territories did it 12 years ago. And so the Northwest Territories started working on it about 2 years after the Yukon Territory accomplished it. So it's been going on for a while out there. I think we can learn some things from them. Of course, it'll be customized for us and have what works for Montana. Gary?
In this session to DNRC to actually begin the planning process for assuming management of these public lands, just in order to kick everything off and get it rolling?
We've got several land bills. I think we've got about a dozen different public land bills that will be coming forward in this session. Some will be to study this issue. I'd rather start with a legislative study on getting some of the big questions answered before we hand it over to the executive branch, because the executive branch has already come out and said they're dead set against it. So I don't think they'll give us an unbiased position statement on it. So we need to, I want a bipartisan committee that's going to study this a little bit further and then make our recommendations to the legislature. But we've got a number of bills trying to get things improved, not just transfer the land. Transfer the lands is a long game. I mean, it's going to take a while to get there, but we've got, if we educate and we push, we can get it done quicker. But we're going to bring some other things too to improve conditions on these lands. This isn't the only thing we're working on. We've got serious problems and we've got to come up with some serious answers really quickly. Yes, sir?
You know, it's ironic, but the red portion up here on your map is identical to the Wildlands Project of the United Nations, and they plan over the next 100 years to make 50% of the land mass in North America off limits to human habitation. And what they predict is exactly identical to the red portion of your map there.
Yep.
I don't know how many people are familiar with the United Nations Agenda 21 program, but that's identical to the Wildlands Project projection over the next 100 to 150 years. And so I don't favor any federal transfer of property, because you got to get the federal government out of the ownership process, return it to the state, and then manage it.
Yep.
And manage it properly, because they plan to take over the entire world. Actually, this is a worldwide movement. Not only the United States, but the world. And the people have to become aware of what is happening behind the scenes, and they're satisfied with incremental movement toward ownership.
Well, there's no doubt that there's people that want those resources and they don't want us to have them. And that's a big part of where the funding comes from for locking them up. So once these lands are transferred to the states, it breaks up that monopoly and empowers the people in the states to manage the lands the way that they see fit. Yes, ma'am.
Basically, you put out why we should do it, but my big question is how? How are you going to make more jobs, make it viable? How are you going to protect the environment? How are you going to protect the watershed? I mean, the state is pretty much giving away our water rights. How can we trust the states with our lands?
Good question. Well, number one, you know, this discussion about the transfer of public lands has gone from a fringe idea that not many people heard about 2 years ago to a national conversation. And a lot of that's because of the energy of a handful of us are putting into it. And I'm putting a lot of my own time into this and energy. And so is Representative Manzella and others. Now, if I don't have to work on the federal government, I can concentrate on state government. And that's where my focus is supposed to be and should be. And it will be once we get the lands under state management. The state of Montana already manages 5 million acres of public land. We have the state forestry department, we have the fire department, you know, the wildland firefighting crew. We've got at least one member of that crew here tonight. We've got a Department of Environmental Quality that oversees environmental permitting, enforces environmental regulations. We've got a state fish and wildlife department that manages our wildlife. We've got all the agencies in place to do this now. Incrementally, as far as when we take the land, that's a question that we need to resolve. Do we take it all at once, or do we go for small increments? Now, there was a Democrat senator in the legislature on the last day, the last hour of this discussion during the interim, who suggested perhaps we could acquire 1% a year over 100 years. Now, wait a second. That sounds kind of slow, right? But think about it. That gives us a chance to beef up our agencies as necessary, for them to figure out what they need to do to catch up. That's still like 250,000 acres a year. We could go into those high priority areas. It's going to be hard to treat 250,000 acres in a year. So I think that will give us an awful lot to work on. And it would allow us to adjust our policies and so forth, our budgeting and how we go about things to adapt to that transition. I'm not saying I'm going to push that, but it opens up the ideas on the range that we have available. We could do a little bit per year over a certain period of time, or we could do all of it all at once, which is going to be up to the people to decide and your elected representatives to decide. But we can do it. We know we manage public lands well. All the western states manage public lands. We outperform the feds in every category on our public land management. I don't think the lands have to be managed, the lands we acquire don't have to be managed exactly like the state trust lands are being managed. The state trust lands have a constitutional mandate to bring in the highest and best use, the highest economic gain. That's why the grazing fees are high. We don't have to do that on these transferred lands. We can set up a new framework for these lands that prioritizes with Montana values that are more general, like the access, the health, the productivity issues, the balance management, the multiple use. We can set policies for the environment that are different than the constitutional mandates of the state trust lands. But we have managed a lot of land, and we've done a good job of it. The proof is in the pudding there.
I was just going to say, Jennifer, based on that number you just gave with the recommendation of 1% over time, keep in mind that 250,000 acres is the delta between the 5,000 acres that you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, when the feds were going to manage that 1/10 of 1% of what the governor determined to be the 5 million critical acres. So even at 1%, that's a heck of a step.
Yeah, and I would want to see us prioritize those imminent risk landscapes first. You know, we've got communities that are at severe risk. We've got communities in Mineral County, citizens are having their insurance policies canceled because the federal land is in such bad condition. You know, several, within a mile or two of their land, it's not even adjacent, but they're having their insurance policies canceled because the fire risk is so bad in those communities.
Along those same lines, would the economic factor, not only fire danger, but don't you think that economics should be portion of which lands are decided to start with first? I mean,
Yeah.
it's somewhere that would-
Yeah, I think Representative Kerry White, he's one of the board members of Citizens for Balanced Use out of Bozeman, and he's working on some legislation that will empower the state DNRC to start working in some of those areas now. Some areas that will pay for themselves as far as going in and cleaning up, or getting some timber out that actually pays for the cost to go in and clean them up. So yeah, economics is a huge factor that we're going to have to get a handle on. But I just got some reports out of Colorado that showed after those big wildfires they had down there, they did an economic analysis. And those reports showed that for every dollar that's spent on preventing wildfires by vegetation management, they save $17 in wildland firefighting costs. And for every dollar that's spent on vegetation management to reduce fire hazards, they're seeing $500 saved on overall total damages. Because fighting the fire is just a small part of the cost of a fire. The real damage comes when your watershed is destroyed, when all those toxins and ash and silt, the toxic silt washes into your waterways, kills your fisheries, gets into your municipal treatment systems. Our municipal treatment systems can't process sludge. So you're talking about millions of dollars of upgrades like in the city of Helena when that watershed goes up in smoke. They're not going to be able to access that water for years. They're not going to be able to make that watershed healthy again for decades, and that's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars to restore it to a healthy forest. Yes, ma'am?
Just to show the difference between state managed lands and the federal managed lands, somebody in the Bitterroot, and you can help me, did a video, and then they have helicopter views of the state lands that are right next to the federal lands that burned in 2000. And
I've seen that.
And the difference is,
Yeah, well-managed forests don't burn at that high intensity that dead forests do. Thick, overcrowded dead forests, they just burn at such a high intensity, in fact, we're losing them. The Bitterroot Valley was studied by a forestry professor out of Montana State University. Dr. Cole came and testified during our federal land study. And he gave me a copy of his report, and it shows that in the Bitterroot Valley, what was forest before the big burn is now grassland, and it's permanent. It's not regenerating because it's scorched, and the soil and all the life in the soil is so deep, like 8 feet deep, everything was dead. So it's sanitized soil. The only thing that's able to grow is the grasses on top. They're not seeing any regeneration of forest there. So we're actually losing forest because we're locking it up and we're not logging it and managing it. Yes, sir.
Seems to me on this, the volume, we have to get off of our duff because the people in the national and international conservation people who are throwing a monkey wrench into our Forest Service doing anything with these lawsuits and the tactics they're using, we need to get our land back in our hands and get to managing it so that we get out of that element. You know, the states don't get sued. We don't get sued by these conservation outfits like the federal government does.
Yeah.
And in doing so, we're managing, we have a chance to manage our land during these tragic situations.
That's right. There's an awful lot of lawsuits levied against the Forest Service every time they try to do a timber sale. I mean, they can't cut one tree without getting sued, and they're losing most of the lawsuits. So the laws are so convoluted from the federal level that the federal agencies can't even follow the laws. If they could, they wouldn't lose the lawsuits. And then they put the policy in to actually pay the litigants to do the lawsuits. So the litigants have found quite a lucrative industry to go in and just sue the federal government every time they do something, and they throw a million different reasons for why they think there's something wrong with what the feds are doing. And if the judge finds one that has a little bit of a connection and he rules in their favor, they get all their costs reimbursed. They're collecting expert witness fees and attorney's fees in the hundreds of dollars per hour rate. And when that law was first passed, Equal Access to Justice, it was supposed to be so a citizen that otherwise couldn't bring a suit against the federal government had the ability to bring a suit, and if they won on 3 points, that they would get reimbursed for their costs, and the attorney's fees were like $125 max. the citizen had to earn less than $3 million, but it's been morphed and it's been up, so now you've got these multi-million-dollar organizations like Sierra Club and their affiliates that are bringing the suits, and they're making a lot of money. They'll win on one little technicality, and they win the suit. And the other thing that's going on that not too many people hear about is that they're doing sue and settle. So they'll threaten to sue, they'll file a suit, but then they'll settle out of court in a private agreement. The federal government, the federal agencies are giving these groups money, and Congress has been trying to find out how much money has gone to these groups, and they won't tell Congress. So we don't know how much of our tax dollars have gone to these organizations. Another question back here? Mark?
Well, I just wanted to talk about your event tomorrow.
Okay.
And the whole idea, I mean, this is one-sided, right? You're presenting the proposal, and it's helpful for people to make decisions when somebody's grilling Jennifer, right? So there's an organized, educated man that's going to debate her tomorrow. Do you want to tell her about? Tell
Yeah. So tomorrow night, the Montanans for Multiple Use Organization out of Kalispell is hosting a debate on this issue, and I'm going to debate Representative Ed Leeser from Whitefish. He was on the federal land study with me. He's opposed to the transfer of public lands. And so you're going to hear both sides tomorrow night on why he's opposed and why I'm for. And it's going to be a little bit different format than tonight. It's going to be professionally moderated. So that's going to be at Flathead Community College tomorrow night at 7 p.m. The doors open at 6:30. And it's free to the public. And they've got a lot of room in there, so bring your friends. Yeah.
Jennifer, I'm all about keeping things simple. So if the federal government is deficit in your operation, you're going for derelict in your management, what about just simply filing a lien against them and take possession by default? They haven't got the money to cover it now, so give them a shot of their own medicine. They file a lien on everybody else.
Yeah, there's some exploration going on our options for how to deal with this. And the legal minds that are coming to this issue are pretty incredible. So what all they've come up with, I don't know. I did have a chance to go out to dinner with about 12 members of the legal team that have put themselves together in Utah. And it's a powerhouse of thinking. And so that's kind of out-of-the-box thinking. I mean, they're looking at it from every angle. But we've got laws and we've got to follow laws, so we can't do whatever we want to do, but we have to educate ourselves on what those laws are. Another piece of legislation I'm going to bring this session is to make sure that our state employees that work for the legislature, our legal counsel, actually get trained on state's jurisdiction. A lot of times when I go to them for information, they give me the federal perspective and the federal reports, and I want the state perspective and the state reports that show how we can stand up for ourselves as a state. So that's something hopefully we'll get past this session to help our legal counsel get more educated on it and help them help new legislators understand those issues better too. Dennis?
I have my opinion on our 3 congressional delegates to Congress. I don't have faith in any of the 3 of them for proceeding on this concept. Do you have a different take than, which is much more positive than mine?
I think, I think when it becomes popular, that they'll support it. It's the truth. I mean, it's the right thing to do. Congressman Daines is working really hard on federal issues, but he's not come on board with this. He's trying to still tinker with, Congress making the decisions, and that fundamentally doesn't work. We need Montanans to make the decisions, the people that are accountable to the people in Montana. It's just not a priority for all those states. Those 38 states that have little red in them, they don't know what our issues are, and they don't really care. They don't understand what it's like to live out here. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to stick around to answer questions individually. You can come on up. Is there something else by Sportsmen for Fish and Wildlife you want to, before we go? Thanks, everybody. I'll stick around for a while to answer your questions.
Yeah, just another couple items here, and then again, sandwiches, cookies, drinks at the back of the room. But we did talk a little bit at the beginning about filling out this questionnaire. It'll really help us because we're going to poll our membership on whether or not to support the resolution that Jennifer talked about earlier. And we need this filled out. So if you're a member or not a member, fill it out. There's a way of either